Tene kumzi shibadi mogoche ngabadi lati cheje.
We don't need to go through the ocean. We now go through the fifth type of meditation.
Ani ngabadi ta khalawre kazangima ngeti chidi 가장 담보다고 기치도 나바디나 신체의 시에 하게 도마르니 도베타선 고아차버치니 아시메바르 예베도 지켜버치 되네 수수이 줄을 된지기 라문에 주버진바디 하게 계단이 용도는 맞춰버치 엔티네 된지디 주버 된지기로 신도 좀나 엔티버치 지타도 강도 좀 거야다 엔티르제니 메바 타지 타르신 메도 냠도 komne 이시디기 굉장히 어디다 가상이 먼저 사와드려.
So with actually this fifth type here, well, I've discussed early on, I described in the very beginning, what I described was that initially one meditates on the fact that phenomena are merely imputed by conceptual consciousness. One is able to differentiate between existing inherently and existing in general. One is able to draw the line between those two. And then one is also able to identify the lack of inherent existence or existence on its own side. One is able to identify that, and one analyzes the fact that if something exists inherently, then it has to be either inherently one or inherently different. So none of those is the case. Phenomena do neither exist as inherently one nor as inherently different. Therefore, they cannot exist inherently. So thus, when one focuses on, one practices, one sustains that understanding of the lack of inherent existence, the lack of existence on its own side.
一直维持在这样子的是无自信这样子的一种想法当中，那这个呢就是守护这样子的一种相续，守护这样一个想法的相续，就是所谓的修空性。
但是心没多那个空白地来呀。能设计的，可能你们知道才是， 기지 담보라 러시메도 제 기지 니버 순반에 지하면 텐트레지 차선 신상에 되게 거두 양 진짜 매버지는 러시메도 신 전세비 제라 심테서디 유진들 때지 매도니 비테보 코나려야 심진딩 되게 용거 다디 요 쳐버라다 대만이 뭐지 랑원 랑신이 민두 신 매버디를 심진도 보고로다
Then with regard to the person who does it properly, who does understand the lack of inherent existence and then meditates on that. So there are different types of person now. So having identified the lack of inherent existence properly, nonetheless, as was explained earlier, for a few moments a meditator may focus on such a lack, but then stop any kind of mental activity and focus on the absence of mental activity is one possibility. Another possibility is that a person identifies correctly the lack of inherent existence, focuses on that for a moment, but then right away focuses on the awareness which focuses on the lack of inherent existence. So apprehends the mind that perceives the lack of inherent existence. So this is another possibility, but the way to really do it would be is illustrated by the third possibility, where one focuses just on the lack of inherent existence.
아니 정신기 매버 고메디 이니 단다디 가시기다 요아체니 아니 콜로바베기 시에디에디 정신 매버 고메레 아니 콜로 타마기 시에디에디 정신 매버 고메 마레 다 드제 지야이라메 다 미치바 야다 시에발레 세리르 미바 다 드제 고나신다레스 세니 다 콜로 타마디 야가레스 다 타르두레스 이제 숨기 열대 콜로 타메 콩도르다 땡주 다 마기 숨도서 시거 디지디 땡주 나로네 다 추인 되바다 그래서 장주 셈제다 그래서 콜로 타메 콩도르 디지기도 레디 콜로 타메 공제라고 그러다 공제를 지기 열대 추인 되바 나로라 안에 자신이 뭐 공고에 대해 추인 되고 그러는 거 세부시고 숨셔
Now, with respect to now meditating properly on the lack of inherent existence, well, there's still some who differentiate between the kind of emptiness that is set forth in the middling wheel, or the second wheel of Dharma, and the emptiness that is set forth in the last wheel of Dharma. So, in other words, they say that in the middling wheel of Dharma, in the second wheel of Dharma, it is actual lack of inherent existence that is set forth, whereas in the third wheel of Dharma, lack of inherent existence is not set forth, but rather the stopping of mental activity and focusing on the clarity or the knowing nature of the mind, that this is set forth or postulated during the third turning of the wheel of Dharma, which is the kind of final view, which is the kind of highest view. And also the teachings of the third wheel, those teachings are also the source text for the tantric teachings. So in general, those are the tantric teachings. The tantric teachings are based on the third wheel. However, when we talk about, for example, the praise to Dharmadhatu, which is also based on the third wheel of Dharma, so the praise to Dharmadhatu in this text, it says very clearly that one has to meditate on the lack of inherent existence. So Nagarjuna's text says that clearly.
Tadina shin samadhi wala suvi gyu mongbo nanglole ani pagi demani ma jeba se disu anu kongkoye sungudo demani ma jeba.
So likewise, in the Guhya Samaja scriptures, you find this explanation of focusing on not being generated since primordial, primordially not being generated. So from the beginning, never having been generated, so that explanation is given in the Guhya Samaja.
And Chitang Pagi Toluda, Marula Tawa Cheba Yu Sungi Yore, Sungi Dede Yore, and Cheba Me Sungi Yore, and Dila Tajidu and Giwasha Umaris. And one of the Sungi Dibati Sungdo. Kares and Tawa Se, the Nipagi Tajaki Yula, and Kuhechita, Eugene Kuheni Yores, Tawa Se City. Eugene Godona and Dodamala Cheba Yores. Yugi Mondo Chena and Kejesheva Ina, Dodamala Tawa Cheba Yomaris, or Tinusundo.
Likewise, in general, when we think about the view from the point of view of the sutric system and the view from the point of view of the tantric system, well, some say that there is a difference between the sutric view and the tantric view, and some say there is no difference. So taking those two assertions, well, they're contradictory, so one needs to be able to solve that kind of apparent contradiction. And something as Homi Dalai Lama usually says during the teachings, he kind of clarifies it when he explains that there are two types of view. There is the objective view and there's the subjective view. Or in other words, there's a view from the perspective of the awareness and a view from the perspective of the object. Now, the view from the perspective of the awareness is different in the sutric and tantric system, whereas the view from the perspective of the object is the same.
Any Kallavre. Marala Govara, Tala Chashava in the Mida to Harsigure, Chita, Yuguti Meto Bishira to the Yugunangari Maris, Mosushim Chitigor, Chibachi.
So, with regard to my own understanding, something I have investigated myself, examined myself, so with regard to the wisdom realizing the lack of true existence of the sprout, does the sprout appear to that awareness or not?
And did you come there? And Nangamari said, the Lord about Chavad. And in teacher, Nangiri said, the Lord about Chavad. Yanda Nangamari said, the Lord about it. That the courage in a reason. Did you come there? Umasawata, you call her Tony Tossi, Chen, Kazan, Dilaman, Kazumunzi to the Che, and Chebitar and Chen, Manyabana, the king on the Shahej. The some of the quarter do, and Chetar, and choosing the latter was Sovreta. Manyeva Cham, the Tasha, and choosing Nang said, Mengitage, Chesa choosing Nang, Chesa Tintiji, the Tonito, Lava, Quadra in them, Tony Vishera, the Shemana, said, Lodeva Chichare.
So, with regard to whether the sprout appears to the mind that realizes the emptiness of the sprout or not, well, thinking about it from one side, taking it to kind of examining it from one perspective, it seems more likely that it doesn't appear. Whereas seeing it from another perspective, it seems more likely that it does appear. So here when we talk about realizing the middle way, in other words, realizing emptiness, well, initially one identifies the object of negation and then by way of examining, by way of analyzing, looks whether it can be found, or checks and examines whether the object can be found. And when it cannot be found, then in that moment, the sense of not finding it, with that kind of technique of not being able to find it, in that moment the object gets lost. So there's a strong sense therefore from that perspective that someone who realizes emptiness by merely depending on checking, analyzing the object, examining it, searching for it, and not being able to find it, that when one goes through this kind of process, one won't be able to find the object, and so the object doesn't appear. So from that perspective, it seems strongly the object doesn't appear.
That DJ la ane ta rashin medo nyam to kongu res di samlo de ledi lung de zo tong di chi di ane pumba mitaba la ban de shin pumba rashin gi meba re pumba temper meba res di le di ane an chu jin nang ko e samlo shi le da.
So, but then after that, now one needs to meditate on the lack of inherent existence. So one understands that this needs to be done. For example, one sees scriptural evidence for this, that one has to meditate now on emptiness. And then in the same way, as one considers that a vase, for example, is impermanent, in the same way one now thinks, well, the vase doesn't exist truly, the vase doesn't exist inherently. So thinking along those lines, it seems again that the vase needs to appear to that mind realizing the emptiness of the vase.
Ta DJ la ane koha di ta pechi tsik pechi chetan chik di tsik di pechi di chena yabo de yuji ma re lola pagu ma re ma uruchi ine di pechi chena namsa kota choya le kibari yore chesan tsik di pechi chewa ina tsik kar re se na rangwani pumba chu chen che di ane rangwani yuwa pa si kacha che di ma yin se dinti rang ta di re da re di ine dinti kecha ma sheba che yuwa pa kacha che pumba chu chen che ona pumba yuwa ma yin le uwa re se na dinti ma re pumba rangi mwene yuwa ma re se o dinti kuwa di le undi khazan rangdong ki che she yin pa khazan yin chesan pumba rangi mwene Tongbares. Lungwene Tana, Pumbaredi, Yoredi, Rangwene, Tongbares, Tilidi, Rangwene, Shena, Bebares, Rangwene, Tongbarelati, and Chijin Nae Medinich. Jamitaba, the Edina, Tesmita Chatumich.
So after that, we may be able to use these falling words, whether that's really okay or not, it's not sure, but the point is here for a better understanding, one may be using these falling words. So usually, the way we explain it is like the vase, for example, that's kind of the subject, that's the kind of main focus. So the subject vase, it does not exist truly. It does not exist from its own side. So, but we can say this differently here. We can also say, instead of saying it does not exist inherently, we use the word it does not exist. So instead of saying it the usual way, we say it does not exist. But what are we talking about? We're not just saying the vase does not exist. We're saying the vase from its own side. The vase from its own side, that does not exist. So this is also explained also kind of part of talking about what I mentioned earlier, what Gisela mentioned earlier of self-emptiness, being empty of itself. So being empty of itself in the sense that here the vase is existing from its own side, by way of from its own side, from the vase's side itself. So even though the vase appears, it does appear to the mind, it exists from the perspective of the mind, but from the side of the object, it does not exist. So in that sense, when one has that kind of sense that the actual focus here is such a vase existing from its own side, and then saying that does not exist, then in that case, the object does not appear. It seems the object does not appear. That kind of existing vase existing from its own side as being the subject here, as being the focus here. It seems that in that case it doesn't appear.
所以，如果我们从第三种解释方法平流自方空这样的概念去理解所谓的空性的时候呢，这时候的有法也不会显现出来。
他之前呢，랑문이 유메 유비 체버드 체니 가정 문제지니 탈 고민 뒤에니 달라 때는 랑문이 민두 녀부 공부를 다 시단 뒤라 아니 직도에 달러를 뒤용다 기구도 삼바타고 리버든 기구도 삼바타고 이제 삼수유나 송가.
So here now saying that phenomena do not exist from their own side. So being able to differentiate now between existing from its own side and existing in general, having differentiated so in such a way, then one identifies the object of negation, and then in dependence on a correct reason, in dependence on a correct syllogism, one now establishes the lack of inherent existence, the lack of existence from the side of the object. So does that make sense or not? Is there anyone who has any opinion or any kind of opposition to this kind of explanation? Is there any kind of scriptural proof or any reasoning that would disagree with this, or that would oppose that? If there's any kind of opinion, any attitude you hold, please say so.
하나님 랑은이 민두 냠볼로디 냠고를 세주고 이 냠고는 또 무슨 마도도 봐도 로기다 냠고 기지를 냠고 주면은 만약에 내가 되는 게임을 지비차 동산디가로 도셔기 이러고 기지를 로기 민두 냠고는 아니 비니 아지지 나와 차로 조이는데 간디슬리기 이러고 기지를 구구면은 야야야 내제 민두냐 뭐냐면 내가 동상을 거셔기 그러면서 뒤통화지기도 아니 가지고 돈이 무슨 또 인데 또 무슨 게 민두냐 밖에 저기 말아 내가 랑심에 봐 로디기 지나기 위해 여바디 최신이 나와 대화랑 동이 뭐 송장 뒤중쟁이게 이제 심어지 그래서 그래서 뒤나 아니 가지고 근데 민두 방향 보이나야 가져 다다지 캐요나 한 몸이가 대가랑 춘이 되는 차되고 뭔가 민두만년 보이는 뒤가 샤프는 대가랑 손이 또 저로 또 두고 말했어요. 그래. Kiji tambon ta ramuni mindu nyamdu tenwa. Ta kiji nigo sumba kale ramuni mindu stindi tenwa res. Jirwa. An ti ma tenwa ina ani mindu nyamdu ma tigde. Ani pena kiji ngas badu mindu che. Tene mindu ma tena ani lodi tar toni ma zimba tawo, toni ma toba tawo. Ta chiya ila michi watawo, tidi kan pa tenwa watawo zigo res. Chigirwa. Al tambu tilana.
Geshe-la repeated what Trungpa said. So Trungpa said to first talk about the first question, the first aspect. So the question that was asked here is with regard to when you realize emptiness conceptually for the first time. So as has been explained previously, one should be thinking if the phenomenon does not exist inherently. So one thinks that, let's say, for 5 moments, does one have to think it doesn't exist inherently, does one have to bring that to mind repeatedly? Because if one doesn't do so, one may end up taking to mind nothingness, as in like falling into this kind of extreme of not taking anything to mind, stopping any kind of mental activity. Is that true? Is that a kind of danger that unless one remembers in each moment the lack of inherent existence, one falls into that extreme of holding on to just nothingness?
Sine ta shukji kena ane ta pagi digi shukdi gyundi shuk dagaran chikpa chikyanchi ane mu khazi tuiba ine ta ramuni meba toto rima to kiji ririla ramuni midu tenze tengu kuma resin tengu.
So Geshe-la's response here is saying that if you realize emptiness, like in the first moment, there's this thought, it doesn't exist inherently, and there's some kind of force behind that. There's a force behind that continues on, where you just focus on that force, in the sense that you just focus on the lack of inherent existence, but it's through the force of that first time realizing it, and you don't need to in each moment think, it doesn't exist inherently, it doesn't exist inherently.
Ine ta tingizi timbo mebi le tambo yu kabla chesa taginye le laba nashi ramuni mindu nyamdu teni entes ne judu yang la zhuye chi di shu di tata ne ma tuba che ne ma tu na ta chi yayi le me che wata wale da chosha ya chi di ji du mindu nyamdu tong tong che yang chi kwa ne che ta cheba di tagi tambo nashi cheba chasang cheni pake re ne shi tsabo che wu ma ra tambo cheba che du re ne cheni shi tsabo ma che na 타들 랑신 민두년도 domjaba ine 우주 접저로 차루 이주의 차루를 제가 쓰면 차마 레디 담보 개부 전에 에네 숙지 내 사회 제라 랑신 민두님도 대스샤 야야 연조 권의 제 다들 연조 권의 제도 전에 테스트 제마도 되기는 개부 제고예요 말 제부 통동지체 야 디기 톤에다 정말 매비 가르치요로 말 진단기 나디 레토버지 어디 전에 야 대신이 뭐샤 디치데 ane kanzamne nyambar shayade rinru chodi ane pagi kishirila midu matene di mewa shudi tata le tungichi legu yusar.
So now with regard to thinking it doesn't exist inherently, so the point is here, if someone is a beginner, if someone doesn't have a lot of concentration, then that continuous kind of sustaining the object, as in like abiding with the object, one won't be able to do that for very long, because before long one will get distracted. And getting distracted, one may then fall into that kind of extreme in the sense that one will stop any kind of mental activity and just focus on nothingness. So therefore what is better for in that case would be to keep it short, to focus on the lack of inherent existence for some time. So initially there's the thought lack of inherent existence, and the force just allows the mind to remain with that object for some time, and then one leaves it at that and goes through reasoning again. But the second time the reasoning can be much shorter. The time one spends on analyzing, on investigating can be much briefer, much shorter. the very first time one needs to investigate well. The very first time before one has realized emptiness, or in order to now newly realize emptiness, one needs to really spend time to extensively investigate whether the object of negation can exist or not. If one doesn't do it and just kind of tries to focus on the lack of inherent existence, it becomes some kind of insistence when one forces it in a way and does not really generate an inferential cognizer that realizes emptiness. But once one has realized emptiness and has remained with the object for some time, then now, after letting it go, before the distraction arises, then it one again goes briefly through the reasoning. One doesn't spend much time, but a little bit one goes through some of the reasoning. And again, when this kind of force of apprehending the object is there again, one focuses on that. One absorbs the mind into that state. And then slowly, through habituation, one is able to remain with the emptiness a little longer. One is able to remain longer with emptiness, without having to think lack of inherent existence, lack of inherent existence in each moment. That is not necessary.
其实你即使没有每一秒都在提醒自己说无自性，你还是可以维持在这样子原者无自性的这个状况当中。那刚才讲到说如果有仔细做这样子的一个观则，全面性仔细的广泛的观则，生起来的是比量去证得我们说的这种无自性，否则的话呢就变成用四暇式去证得。
但你们的对于我送的作用的，我的面度，你们的这把的这样嘛是吧？的东北这些是吧？第几的在呢？他第了，当你能追的缺陷的面，那我怎么着是？对是吧？第几的，第一呢？
东北你，就是东北你，听到越来越大的，缺陷面那我台湾上你去年这是，缺陷面那我说东北听到越来越来是。 这些东西都是东西听到越来越大，是先把解决的是。但其实缺陷面那台湾人去年这些呢，过缺陷那里面说台湾人东西听到越来越是老百姓呐，那我就吸引那个啦，你搞这也不是我说日本搞这，你民族社他这是那个东山去吃的吧？那台湾人去年恰多嘛，就是，嘛，这东西民族嘛也那样，大家可能去年听到越来越有嘛，就是。
아니 시내가 어떻게 컨트롤해서 시주민 기버체 시주가 유배 기버체 아니
땅에 만니가
다다디
직도되는 시주비체 많이
저번에 다다디나라이나 숨바디라고
라라 동고를 힘내봐
제비타를 아니 많이 해봤다 이거 샤네 아시메바 다들 내게 말해서 뒤로
제비타를 다가 직도되도 많이 해봤지 이 많이 해봤지 기타 라시 미두세 지가 라시 많이 해봤지 모르봐 많이 해봐 대가라는 거 하나로 샤샤나
제가 많이 지단 주제 제니 많이 해봤다 가라 로다
많이 해봤다 가라
되게니 아시메바 많이 해봤다 그래서
세진나라게 야야기 타강대 문제 번째 이 도바 신도 되지 또 거기에 이 주주 신발修成的
경기도 거세 하기 다 가정 문제도 제비터랑 시민도 냠도 제목과 제비터 많이 해봤다 가라 안토니도 샤다 뒤로 와서 그래서나 최신의 미나와 다가라 아니 돈이 나서 저주도 와서 내가 뒤 조금에나 냠샤 있는 것으로 돈이 지나 유들레다 가르레스 이래서 다다 킹이 소에디 아니 세제남다 디요레 그래서 유지야마 주발라 뢰장 안테다 튀바치네 지양 이름의 집을 샤바디 다 샤바디라 아니 친구 고마스네 따바레스 어디 숨거 진짜 다디 가르레스 디레
So the second part of the question is with regard to realizing that phenomena, so directly realizing the lack of inherent existence. So the lack of inherent existence, it is explained that when the mind directly realizes the lack of inherent existence, it is actually just the lack of any conventional truth appearing to the mind. So there's no conventional truth that appears to the mind, no subject, that is no kind of focal object appearing to the mind that is the understanding, or that is the direct realization of emptiness. So this is how it's usually explained, and if that is so, is there no kind of other object of apprehension here, no other kind of mode of apprehending emptiness? Is there nothing extra that needs to be explained here? And if no, well, wouldn't that be similar to the case of like a third type of meditation that has been described here, a third type of wrong type of meditation that has been described in Geshe-la's text here? We're saying that first you investigate whether phenomena, if they exist, they have to be existent as inherently one and not inherently different. And if one finds, dependent on that reasoning, that phenomena do not exist as inherently one or as inherently different, one therefore comes to the conclusion that nothing can be found, and then that just that kind of complete empty state, just that complete empty state, wouldn't that be the same thing of just nothing appearing, so that kind of sense of nothing appearing to the mind, wouldn't that be similar? And then the other Geshe-la here, the other beginner, he cited something from the, he cited the quote from Laman Tsongkhapa's Golden Rosary. So in the Golden Rosary, it also describes that when you don't find the object, when there's no single object, kind of the mind, the awareness that takes that to mind, that is not actual emptiness, that is not authentic emptiness. That's a supportive quote for saying that this is not actual emptiness.
That this is an engela that Tony Musundo to Lotigi, that Pagi Tony Nandandi, and a Chichi Minawa Zamgi race and a Pidgey Martin into Shireda.
So, firstly, what needs to be said is that when we talk about the wisdom that directly realizes emptiness, so saying that this wisdom consists, or this wisdom is a type of awareness to which nothing appears, so no subject appears, actually that, just that mere non-appearance is not okay, to explain it in that way.
That 도디바당 디즈나로라 아니 수미통 초라미통 디시미통나 아니 디니 최통어레스 시티디요르 친이통어레스 토레마통나 나가통라바나시 아니 수르티르 따드카제 수드 좋아다 디기디 풍부디기디 마통나 아니 친이통스레그레스 어디디시 소요르.
So therefore, this just mere non-appearance cannot be described as emptiness. And in the condensed perfection of wisdom sutra, one finds these words that no physical form, no feeling, and so forth. So not seeing feeling, not seeing physical form, and so forth. That not seeing is seeing suchness. So likewise, in the same way as not seeing obstructiveness, obstructive contact is seeing unconditioned space. So in the same way, not seeing the physical body and so forth is described as seeing emptiness.
제가 당보딩의 신체는 최제마 통화 다가랑 친이 통화라나 당보까지디. 근데 지야 이름에 제버디에다 친이 통화 차로로. 다 뒤에 말했어.
So this actually here is saying that if you don't see the focal object, the kind of basis or the subject, if you don't see, here subject means the focal object of the emptiness, if you don't see that, if that means seeing suchness, well that would be the same as saying stopping any kind of mental activity would be like seeing suchness, would be like seeing emptiness.
다 뒤에 뒤전에 다 니버디라. 이거는 지 가서 테스트 개발차 지르마 통한상 말레스 라신기 유에나 아니 딘지기 주지기 lö디기 주진이 통거레스 니에거레스 니에 그바레 안 주진이 마니나 라신이고 통시그레스 다기진 다도스레오다.
So one needs to specify this. This is not possible explaining it the way that it was explained before, so that we need to specify that. What does it actually mean? It means that if a phenomenon were to exist truly, the type of mind, that wisdom, realizing emptiness, that wisdom would have to find it, but it doesn't find it. So it would have to find it, but it doesn't find it, and that kind of non-finding is what we mean with not seeing here.
的话，经过观者之后呢，应该要能够见到有法，但是在我观者之后，因为见不到有法的缘故呢，所以我就说呢，我见到的是无自性。
他第几句在呢？아니 디라나 다 되기디랑 자 리고르다 Pagi musum di rakshingi yuena, toni musum do tubilo di nye go bale, manye za, an rakshime ba nye slava ina, an rakshingi yuena, chikna tu chegi chedu rikshidi ki nye go bale, an manye na, an toni nye stagara rewe es, ta yang ju chiwa di le mulwa.
So then likewise with regard to that kind of direct perception, well, the question arises again. So then if it existed inherently, then it would have to be one inherently one or inherently different. And if it really existed that way, then inherently one and inherently different would have to appear, but they do not appear. So this non-appearance here again, that cannot be found by that awareness, would here again be the same.
第的第三呢，아니 다다 가상님은 룸노샤데 주비남시세에 타도 충마 레샤데 타도 충마 나로라 근데 수나미 통 소화데 이미 통송세에 제시디 아니 파비냠샤이시에 자요 제선다 냠샤이시에 다가 지거다 다디 떡벌 키는 지거를 베스나 데스 케벌 메로 삼바시다 다디 가상 페이지 유연 제부제샤 다 당보디 다 두슬라보다 다 조지강라 다 파바 자담 아니 자담 마통하라 미시 마통하 다가는 기타 미시기 자담 내가 떠들다 라 다 디나신 무슨 되기 다 크기 다 정신기 주로디 마통하 다가는 기타 정신에가 나왔다 그치 차두고 다 다가는 키니 똑바로 잖아 되게 돼 똑바로 니는 빼지라고라 빼디치는 제부제
So, when we talk about saying this, when we say, for example, seeing form, not seeing form, or not seeing physical form, not seeing the body and so forth, that is the seeing of suchness. Well, according to the smaller special insight. So the smaller special insight, as well means the small lumbrum, so the special insight section of the smaller lumbrum. So in here it says that this quote, not seeing the physical body, means refers to the meditative equipoise. So not seeing the body is seeing suchness, or not perceiving the body is perceiving suchness, refers to the meditative equipoise. It needs to be seen whether this also refers to the conceptual consciousness. So actually there was an example that I was thinking of before, but I forgot the example. But anyway, when you take this table for example, so with our eye consciousness, there's no flask, there's no cup or no flask on this table. So not seeing the flask on the table means that one realizes it's not there. One realizes the absence of the flask. So just not seeing it means the mind realizes the absence of the flask. So likewise here, with regard to the direct perception, not seeing the lack of inherent existence, not seeing inherent existence, so not being able to perceive, not seeing inherent existence, means that direct perceiver, that meditative equipoise, sees the suchness, sees the lack of inherent existence. But here the question is this also the case for conceptual consciousness? So we've just talked about direct perceivers and eye consciousness or meditative equipoise. But what about conceptual consciousness? There was an example I was earlier thinking of, but I don't remember it.
可这个问题，如果我问到分别心，就是说，那我也把这个同样的这个理论用在分别心上面吗？
但定的心的几个人呢？看了我的看不定，能做了，比如讲人呢，是吧？他比如讲人呢，俺马来的阿里米其列有这些，那你打破穷死呢，带个了，他人呢，但呢，他阿里米的汤嘛是吧？那大家人米西个阿里米米都美国的木松到这儿呗。 di tagi di nan tesi mi rao mi de de mi du an che zang khampa di nan mi du sin tobe ki tom jao ma to mi shi kharang ki tobe yu na des mi rao mi de.
So likewise, for example, let's say in this room there were only Tibetans. Let's assume in this room there were only Tibetans. And then if someone were to say, oh, there's one American in here, then one checks and one goes towards each person, checks each person's face, and then eventually comes to see, no, there's no American in this room. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean here, is it like the same as seeing no cup in front of you with a kind of direct perceiver? Is that the same kind of perception? Or is that more typical to the conceptual consciousness, where you look at each and every phenomenon and kind of eliminate the possibility of that person being an American? So it seems there's a difference between the direct perceiver, which perceives the absence of cup, and the second kind of way of going back to conceptually kind of eliminating, looking at each person and eliminating the possibility that any of these people is an American. So there seems to be a difference between the direct perception that negates the existence of something and the conceptual consciousness that does so.
不太一样的，他认为在这个例子当中，应该是由分别心做出来的结论说，房子里面没有美国人。
야나 미시기 기자마시바 이네 떡바기 다 대민도 아니 민도 대점기 컴바디나나 매바디 떡바디 마떡바체 대를 때네 아니 컴바디나 민도 센타제 공시 미매바 떡바 파기지 미매바 떡바 대기능이 있다 초제주에 서로시라다 따라 때네 초제디 미시기 주 대민도 디 돈네 아니 컴바디나 민도 스타제 고야지
So, with regard to, so it will also leave aside if we were to focus now on the conceptual mind, leave aside the eye consciousness, well now, let's say the eye consciousness were to take each and every person in this room, kind of perceiving this is not an American, this is not an American, this is not an American. So the eye consciousness basically eliminates the possibility that any of the people in this room are an American. That is a little bit like when you have a correct reason, establishing the property of the subject, establishing that the subject matter, the subject itself, satisfies the reason. And then in dependence on that, then you realize the object to be established conceptually. So it's like the eye consciousness establishes, the eye consciousness realizes that each of these people are not an American. And then in dependence on that, it's the conceptual consciousness that in dependence on that, thereafter decides there is no American in this room. Is it like that? That's another possibility.
但你像一些东尼木松的导师的，最近闽南语给这个马来的，因为地老公的这些个老人，那新主办闽南话大了，然后你们可能是做的是给这的偏见写工的这些，你马现在蒙古籍的刚才听，然后呢主办闽南话大了，然后你们可能去做的是，你们像一些的，你们像一些蒙古大感觉长嘛，刚当刚一呢，但不把的那听嘛了，不把然后呢主办闽南的，然后你们闽南的是那你。 那些的，你不管人们的主人没问那的那礼物，的你给没问钱钱，人们的主人嘛那呢，人们的没问那玩意是大了。
So with respect to the meditative absorption here, the meditative active voice directly realizing emptiness, so we can't say that it's just the mere non-appearance of the focal object, the basis for the emptiness, that refers to the realization of emptiness. It's rather the non-appearance of inherent existence, the non-appearance of inherent existence, which here means here the realization or the perception, the appearance of the lack of inherent existence. So the lack of inherent existence, that appearance is fulfilled, it is completed. It is completed by way of inherent existence not appearing. So by way of non-existence not appearing, that fact is therefore responsible for us being able to say that the appearance of the lack of inherent existence is fulfilled, is complete. But this doesn't mean that just to any awareness, if the lack of if something doesn't exist inherently, that means that mind realizes emptiness. For example, to the ear consciousness, a vase existing inherently doesn't appear. But that doesn't mean just because the lack of inherent existence of the vase doesn't appear to the ear consciousness, that the ear consciousness realizes, that the fact that to the ear consciousness the vase existing inherently doesn't appear doesn't mean that to the ear consciousness the lack of inherent existence of the vase appears. But we can say that in general, if the inherent existence doesn't appear, that means that one realizes the lack of inherent existence.
其他呢，等到这个呢，我就定义没的对吧？既然伊拉没学过伊那着，俺觉得人性没把他那着，感觉伊拉没学过对了， 무슨 일이 말해. 님샤마 힘을 다 쳐버려. 지혜는 집에 있는 님샤마 힘을 다 쳐버려. 디지털 라문을 좀 나와라. 거리 라문을 좀 하는 그래. 어디 세부지 나토입니다.
So, now with respect to leaving aside the realization of emptiness, so when we talk about concentrative kind of practices, so concentration, focusing, taking a concentrated kind of state of mind, so here that non-mental activity, that kind of lack of mental activity, not taking to mind anything, so here we can definitely say, so we focus on just the lack of mental activity, or we focus on the lack of inherent existence, but in particular with regard to focusing on the lack of mental activity or no mental activity, we can't say that is a direct procedure, we can't say that is a direct perception. But true existence has to appear, or existence from its own side has to appear. But what appears in that case? What appears as truly existing?
지난다 냠샤기지 시험도 지연 이름을 지어 잘 걸었다. 다가라 냠샤 다가라 또 무슨 도비 냠샤거라 무슨 도비 나오러다 받는데 지연 이름을 지어 차주고 군수비 취 강양 미나로 강양 유도 지고 말로 지연 이름을 지어 저 차고 근데 라신 매버 또 나버데 라신 매도 된전이 쟁겨 말 그런 유의 유징이 나온 누차 딜레도 지연 이름을 지어 다다 차고 냠샤디
But in a way, I mean, one has to actually say that the meditative act was directly realizing emptiness is a kind of mind of non-mental activity, of like a mind that doesn't engage in any kind of mental activity. Why? Because there's no conventional truth appearing to it. So in that sense, nothing conventionally appears to it, and there's also no sense, oh, this is lack of inherent existence. There's no kind of apprehension of this is lack of inherent existence. Because there's no kind of distance between object and subject.
다 자기 유의 인상 디다 장맥이 다 줄치버래. 디 자기 유의 인상 아니 디 용액이 교들라 담불레 담불까라 아니 다다 이름이 집어 공부해서 디 공부이나 냠샤디다 다다 튕기도스 다 디라레디 용 내주지 디로다.
So the reason for that is then saying that one should, as a beginner, so the cause, so this basically that fact serves as a cause for a beginner being told that they should focus on nothingness, they should focus on that kind of lack of mental activity, because that conforms with this meditative active course. So since the meditative active course in a sense is such a lack of mental activity, an awareness is such a lack of mental activity, then as beginners one should focus on such, since that is a good train, that becomes a training in that meditative equipoise which conforms with that.
제자다 단다니 기루초네 냠샤디 치바레 이네디 용해들라 랑은 민두스니 공부했어. 때 그디 레당보 냠샤디 시저디 폐지 취지시가 찍어버렸다. 제시저 당자고 바기 지용네. 다 디냠샤디 용해다 아니 먼저 레당보 가지스 고주거래는데 가가 차더라. 미팅 붙여더라.
So from in the Gilbert tradition, the meditative equipoise is the same. It's the same kind of meditative equipoise, directly realizing emptiness. And then as a beginner, one is told first to focus on the lack of existence from its own side. Now this is also the same in the other traditions. But then how to focus on how to then generate the meditative equipoise as a beginner, then they differ. The techniques that are prescribed in the Gilpa and in the other traditions, they differ.
딜레디 전에 다다 레 담보에 내가서네 아니 제바체마디 기루지 가서 롱라이바 최딜라 아니 되노지지 체모송노 최딜라 가서 최딜라 니나다 제나스르 최딜라 되노지지 체모송 게위치르스 이제 디셰르나 레 담보에 가네 춘이 시수디 춘이 코란을 되는 니나는 되기지 제바체마 코란 춘이를 니나도 되기지 다이든지 셰고도 다디 고와디 야고지라나 아니 신의 디르게 조용도 니나도 버디 하기 로를 차야나 다다지 용사로.
So saying that, well, for a beginner, for example, as Patrick has said, recited early on, that if an awareness has a dualistic